Tariq? Oh my God, it's been so long.
Where's Tommy?
You kidding me? Is that how you want to talk to me?
All right. Where's Tommy, man?
He's dead. Didn't you get the memo?
Listen, this is
Got some balls. You brought a gun to my mother's house?
this exact Uncle Tommy. I swear to my.
Now, one of the biggest questions and confusions around the world of Power is the timeline. I don't reference the timeline much in my breakdowns unless it calls for it, and there is a reason as to why. Generally, the timeline across Power is a bit of a mess. The ages of Ghost, Tommy and Kanan have been changed before. I don't think they knew until later how popular Power would actually be and how they would turn into an entire franchise. Otherwise, maybe they would have tried to make it a bit more intricate with the timeline. The last time that I personally did a timeline breakdown was during my breakdown of Raising Kanan Season 4 Episode 1. That was because the entire episode took place between Season 3 Episode 5 all the way up to Episode 10, just from a different viewpoint that we hadn't seen before. But Raising Kanan is a special case. For Power Book 4 Force and Power Book 2 Ghost, it is a little bit more complex to say the least. Having 2 seasons of Ghost before the final season of Force does throw things off a little. The timeline therefore can be a bit more confusing, especially when it hasn't made much sense before. You also have Tommy coming back to New York from Chicago, that was in Season 1 of Ghost right at the end, and then you have him pop back up towards the end of Season 3 in Episode 9 and 10. That was after Kate received the letter from Diana dressed as Monet. So not only do you have to consider Tommy coming back to New York, you also have to consider Kate within the timeline as well. But while I'm throwing all these pieces of the puzzle at you guys, here's another. Tariq then receives a call right at the end of Ghost Season 4 in the after end credit scene, who we all assume is from his uncle Tommy Egan. So how does it make sense? Where are we in the timeline after Tommy received this text from JP? Where are we heading next? What's the next step for them to take to continue making this timeline make sense? I do think we do need to break it down step by step and run through the events of both Ghost and Force. As always, I have done a lot of research, I've got some quotes from Joseph Sikora that will hopefully help us piece this puzzle together, and what I'll also be doing in this video, I will also have a ticker down below, which will just be a visual representation of the timeline and how we need to get Force up to the moment where Tariq receives that phone call. We need Kate and Tommy to move from one side of the timeline and catch up with Tariq and that phone call right at the end. So over the course of the video, you are going to see these characters jump until we get right to the end. But first up, the text that Tommy received from JP. Now, we haven't actually seen Tommy's family as of yet in Season 3, he has been pulled in a lot of directions, but I do assume that his family will pop back up at some point soon to just pull him in another direction. Towards the end of Season 2, they didn't exactly leave things on good terms. Tommy had a few arguments and disagreements with JP over DMAC. They then let Kate believe that her grandson was dead, and then she relapsed and ended up in hospital. That was right after she put in a lot of good work with her rehab. And I really did kind of feel sorry for Kate, even though we know she's not Mother of the Year, but again, who is in the world of Power? It is a recurring theme. But fast forward to Season 3, there's been no sign of Tommy's family for 2 episodes apart from DMAC. But Tommy did receive this text late on from JP where it mentioned, Kate checked herself out of the hospital and went back to New York. Now, from a timeline perspective, we know Tommy isn't the only character who showed up in Ghost Season 3, so did Kate. So this has to be the moment where Kate goes back to New York, and most likely the moment when Kate was delivered the letter from Diana dressed as Monet. Tariq then also later showed up in Season 3 Episode 10. He looked around and Kate had all these moving boxes around her house. She was packing her things and moving most of her stuff to either Chicago or maybe in a storage unit, who knows. Either way, the clues were there that she was leaving New York again. Now, what we have to bear in mind and why Tariq went to go see Kate in Season 3 Episode 10 is because Tommy was also in New York during this period as well. He showed up in Episode 9 when he went to take out Tasha. We then saw the confrontation between Tommy and Tariq. Tasha then knocked Tariq unconscious, where Tommy and Tasha then hashed things out. They squashed the beef and they went their separate ways for the time being. An episode later, Tommy was still in New York. He stopped Tariq from killing Monet and starting an all-out war with the Tejadas. He had this conversation with Tariq and then he bounced. Now, if the timeline is to continue to make sense, they do have a few more steps they do need to take, which in my opinion is very important for the storyline going forward. At this moment in time, Kate has gone back to New York. We know that from the text that JP sent to Tommy in Episode 2. So in Force's timeline, Power Book 2 Ghost is now coming towards the end of Season 3 of Ghost, where Kate gets the letter from Diana. But because we know Tommy was in and around New York during that period as well, the next thing we have to see or hear is that Tommy went back to New York for a day or two as well. That's the next job for Gary Lennon and the writers to make sense. Tommy now has to go back to New York, have this interaction with Tasha and Tariq. We don't need to particularly see it as the audience because we've already seen it in Ghost Season 3. We just need to maybe hear it in a conversation. Maybe Tommy has a conversation with JP and he asks, so how's Kate doing in New York? Did you manage to sort that other stuff out too? That's the next step for them to continue to make this timeline make sense. Tommy now has to go back to New York as well. But as I mentioned, it doesn't mean he needs to be missing in Force. Maybe there's a small time jump and he has a conversation with maybe JP, maybe even Diamond, or maybe Maria, where she just asks, did you deal with that shit in New York? Where Tommy then kind of says, yeah, I've dealt with it. All it takes is maybe just 1 or 2 lines just to kind of establish exactly where we are with the timeline, just to kind of mention that, yeah, Tommy Egan has been back to New York. So maybe between the gap between episode 5 or 6, that's when Tommy may have potentially gone back to New York to kind of interact between Tasha and Tariq. So that's the next step we have to see in the timeline if it is to continue to make sense. Now after that, we know Power Book 2 Go Season 4 began and came to an end. But in the after end credit scene, Tariq did receive this call. We all assume it was a call from his uncle Tommy, which I do still think is the case, and I do think majority of you guys do as well. They also announced Power Legacy is in the writer's room. I don't think it has a green light just yet, but I do think that probably will follow after for Season 3. But after they take the next step of having Tommy go back to New York, they then need to come to this timeline here, the after end credit scene where Tariq receives this call. That's when the timeline of Ghost and Force have to match up. So how do we get to the after end credit scene? Now this is where I want to bring it to something Joseph Sikora mentioned on a Reddit Q&A, which is something I have raised before. I didn't think I'd be talking about it so soon, but I do think it does give us a hint in terms of how they're going to take that next step for the timeline to potentially make sense when it comes to matching up with the after end credit scene. So I'm just going to read you guys exactly what he said word for word, and then I'll break it down in terms of what I think it actually means. My favourite episode of Power Force was probably episode 309, directed by Eve Rivera. The reason being is that it's almost a false finale, and so much is happening in the episode that the finale episode turns out to be the cream on top. But 309 was such an exciting episode and kind of a bittersweet almost ending to the show. Now his answer to the question around episode 309 and 310 of the final season of Force, in my opinion, suggests and hints that the actual Force Season 3 finale will actually be episode 9. After that, episode 10 actually is supposed to be the cream on top, which in my opinion, where they could potentially fill the gap between Ghost and Force, where they take it in a completely new direction just before Legacy. Between episode 9 and 10, that's where they could actually have the time skip that would catch up Force's timeline with Ghost. We'd all see the events unfold and let them close off all the storylines for the characters in Force up to episode 9, and then have Tommy potentially make that call. This would then allow Gary Lennon and the Force writing team to bring Tariq in from New York, which in turn then sets up Power Legacy. Because if Tommy and Tariq are the lead in that show, then they are going to have to bring both timelines up to the same speed. The fact that Joseph Sikora's mentioned episode 9 is like a bittersweet ending to the show, to me it hints that that's the Force finale. Episode 9 could actually be the end of Force, an almost false finale in his words before we do actually see Tariq. So just to summarize, Tommy has received that text from JP to tell him Kate has gone back to New York. What we now need to see or hear happen next is that Tommy's gone back to New York, because he was also seen in episode 309 and 310 of Power Book 2 Ghost. That's the next step. After that, they then need to bring the timeline up to speed, and how do they do that? That's where Joseph Sikora's hint around 4 Season 3 episode 9 and 10 come in. That's where I think they're probably going to bring the timelines together because of the after end credit scene with Tariq receiving that call, and then also seeing Tariq in Chicago. Episode 10 would then set up Power Legacy. So they do have a few steps that they do need to take for the timeline to make sense first. I do think we're going to have to be patient for it to play out, but Gary Lennon and the writers team do seem like they're addressing the timeline as we go through Season 3. I do also think it is important that they do make it make sense, because if they are going to merge Tommy and Tariq into one show, then they have to bring the timeline of Ghost and Force together. For that to happen, the next step has to be Tommy going back to New York, but we're going to require a lot more patience. Let's see when and if they do address the next step of Tommy going back to New York, and then we can potentially revisit the timeline again a bit later on. Episode 9 and 10, that's something to definitely keep in mind. Those two episodes are going to be huge in the world of Force, and I wouldn't be surprised if they have something to do with speeding up the timeline as well as bringing Tariq one step closer to Chicago. With that being said, drop all your thoughts and comments down below in the comment section, and as always, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.